Welcome to our video on JavaScript, language of the web. Before we begin, let's take a look at the contents of the video and what we will cover. We will begin with an overview of the JavaScript programming language. What is JavaScript? What makes it so important to the web? Then, we will take a bird's eye view of the JavaScript landscape. What are the different pieces and how do they fit together? What are some of the most important JavaScript technologies today? Finally, we will look at next steps. What should you learn if you'd like to become a web developer, and where do you begin? At the end of this video, we hope you'll be ready to begin your journey into web development. So what are we waiting for? Let's jump in. JavaScript is ubiquitous on the client side. We would be hard-pressed to find a site which does not use this language in some form or the other. Therefore, for web developers, the question is not whether we will learn the language, but rather when we will learn it. Let us take a look now at how JavaScript fits into the web application architecture. To understand the role of JavaScript in web applications today, we will need to take a look at the history of web applications. This illustration shows us the evolution of web application architecture over time. When the web first started out, the browser or client's job was only to display the information given to it. This would be in the form of HTML and later in the form of images and other media. Very little interactivity was to be found. After a few years, JavaScript made an appearance. Its job was to bring a little interactivity to web pages. However, all the heavy processing still happened on the server side. JavaScript, by the way, is not related to the Java programming language. The selection of the name was purely a marketing decision. After a few years, with the advent of Ajax, web applications moved to the next era. It was no longer essential to refresh an entire web page in order to update a small value. This meant some of the logic from the server side on updating the view shown to the user moved into the client side. More code was needed to support the shift onto the client side. It's true that the server side did the major heavy lifting, but this was the start of the shift of logic towards the client side. Over time, as browsers evolved and became capable of running more and more complex programs, the UI started to become richer and richer. We saw the advent of web frameworks beginning with jQuery to the more sophisticated frameworks we see now, such as AngularJS and React.js. This concept is important to remember as we explore the role of JavaScript in modern web applications. Another important breakthrough was the release of Node.js, which allowed JavaScript to be run on the server side. While a decade ago there was a clear separation between the front-end developers who built the UI and the back-end engineers who built the business logic and services, today we can see a single person build the functionality from end to end with the help of a single programming language. So let us now see what it means to be a full-stack web developer. To be a full-stack developer, one must be able to handle three different pieces. The first is the UI, or the code which is run in the browser. The main technologies used in the UI are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Moving to the next level, the full-stack programmer needs to be proficient in at least one server-side language, such as Java, Python, PHP, or now JavaScript. Finally, the developer needs a good grasp of at least one database and how to create tables, write queries, and manage the data coming into the application. One of the phrases you might have heard in the context of web development and training is tech stack. And you might have heard the names of some tech stacks such as Mean. What is a tech stack? Simply speaking, a tech stack is the collection of technologies used to build up the application. And MEAN is an acronym which simply stands for the technologies used in one particular tech stack. M stands for MongoDB, E stands for Express.js, A stands for AngularJS, and N for Node.js. Let's understand a little bit more what these mean. So as you can see in the diagram, the web browser runs AngularJS, which is a client-side JavaScript framework. The server side runs a combination of Node.js and Express.js, while the database is MongoDB. Don't worry if you don't understand any of these terms yet. The main thing to note here is a simple fact. With a good knowledge of JavaScript, one can achieve a lot as a web developer. So now let's quickly explore what the JavaScript programming language is like. JavaScript is a very flexible language which has evolved greatly over time. The two main words used to describe it are dynamic and multi-paradigm. Some of the features which represent the dynamic nature of JavaScript are given here. They include runtime object construction, variable parameter lists, functional variables, and so on. On the multi-paradigm side, you can see two distinct paradigms implemented in JavaScript. One is functional programming, which supports first-class functions. The second is object-oriented programming through prototypal inheritance. You can read further using the links given below. Having understood web application architecture as well as a little about the JavaScript programming language, let us now take a look at the technology landscape. Here are some of the more important UI technologies. HTML and CSS is a constant in web development on the UI side, but the JavaScript frameworks used for building applications can change. We can see some examples here. jQuery is free and open source. It is one of the earliest and most popular JavaScript frameworks in use. AngularJS was developed by Google, and it powers many of Google's applications such as webmail and Google Docs. React.js was developed by Facebook. React.js is also a framework which is used to build up rich user interfaces. Vue.js is an open source framework developed by Evan You. Many other frameworks exist and new ones are constantly being developed. Most of these frameworks are developed to help build single-page web applications, which means that without leaving a single web page, the user can perform multiple different functions. Now for some important server-side technologies which are built using JavaScript. There are four major responsibilities of server-side frameworks. The first is working with HTTP request and response objects. So when the browser sends a request, it's received by the server, and the server needs to parse this request to understand what the client is requesting for. Similarly, the server also needs to send back a response which can be transmitted over the network and understood by the client. The second is the routing of the request and the response. We need the server side to understand where the request needs to go and what code needs to be called in order to serve the particular request. The third responsibility of server-side frameworks is to simplify database access. There's a lot of work that goes into opening a connection to a database. Connections need to be managed, errors need to be handled, and so on. So a lot of work happens on the server side, and frameworks are used to simplify database access. Finally, the data which has been brought from the database is processed and it needs to be rendered into HTML. This also happens on the server side. So once we understand these responsibilities, we can also understand how different technologies fit into this landscape. Node.js provides a server-side execution environment. There are many frameworks such as Express.js which help work with the HTTP request and response and the routing. Frameworks such as Mongoose and SQLize help simplify database access, while templating technologies like EJS and Handlebar help render the data and generate HTML. As we can see, the number of technologies is very vast. It can seem quite overwhelming for even an experienced developer, let alone someone just setting out into web development. So let's try to structure our learning and see how we can make an inroad into web development without getting overwhelmed. To become a web developer, one must first learn the basics of JavaScript. Since JavaScript is now used extensively across the technology stack, it's important to go deep and understand some of the fundamental concepts very well. So some of the concepts to learn in JavaScript are, of course, the language basics, the program structure and control flow, the data types, built-in functions, and so on. But in addition, one must also understand functions and the advanced concepts of functional programming such as closures, objects, and some of the advanced concepts of object-oriented JavaScript, including prototypal inheritance. These concepts are crucial to understand how Node.js works and to be able to use technologies based off Node.js effectively. Once we develop a good understanding of JavaScript, the more important thing to do is understand HTML, CSS, and some of the other technologies on the server side. So here is a basic assortment of web development technologies. We need to start with HTML and CSS to be able to build beautiful web pages. We need at least one JavaScript framework which helps us build interactivity. Finally, we need to understand Node.js and Express.js to manage the server side, followed by a working knowledge of SQL for providing database connectivity. All these concepts together make a person a full-stack web developer. We are now going to present an overview of our bootcamp course, which covers all of these concepts in a hands-on and practical way. You can check the details on our Career Crafter website, but here's an overview. The first module covers JavaScript, all of the complete concepts, including code samples and mini exercises. There are no prerequisites to Module 1. The second module covers the basics of web development and helps you build an app from scratch. This 5-day module covers HTML, CSS, jQuery, Node.js, and Express.js. Once again, there are many instructor-led code samples as well as mini exercises. We hope you'll go and check out our course, and I hope this video helped you understand the overview of web applications as well as how you need to begin your career as a web developer. Thank you so much for your time, and please do reach out to us if you have any further questions. Good luck!